In this video, we will talk about morphology and morphological awareness. What is morphology? Morphology is the domain of language, both language use and language study, that has to do with how words are formed, with word parts, and how they systematically map onto word meanings. Here is an example from the Norwegian language. This word is a noun and is created by a process called derivation. So it is derived from a verb by adding a suffix. This suffix is a common one. It can be added to many verbs and always creates nouns that have a certain semantic relationship to these verbs. So these nouns express the action or the outcome of the verb. This is called derivation, and the morphological process that produces these forms falls under the domain of derivational morphology. Derivational morphology is quite extensive in Norwegian. Another important domain concerns inflection. Inflection is when you add suffixes with particular grammatical roles. This is not a general definition across languages, but it's the one that works for the simple case of Norwegian. So the inflection here indicates that this is the definite form of the noun. So the corresponding meaning is that it refers to a familiar instance of this. And this inflection here indicates that it is a plural, and the semantic interpretation is that there is more than one of this. This is inflectional morphology and is commonly associated with grammatical functions on the words. Norwegian is not very rich in inflectional morphology, as there are only a few cases of such inflections. The third domain of morphology is called compounding. In compounding, word roots themselves are joined to form compound stems. So the stem of this verb is itself composed of two other words. In this case, one of the two words is a preposition and the other is a verb. But in other cases, both of the parts can be words. For example, here is another compound, and here is another compound, which is composed of more than one word stem. And they're joined, indicating a certain kind of meaning combination on the new word. Now, knowledge of morphology is a part of knowledge of language. Any speaker of the language implicitly knows these things to the extent one can understand the language and speak it. So normal linguistic knowledge has to do with communication. This doesn't mean that every speaker has an awareness of the existence and function of these things. So above the level of morphology, which is at the linguistic level, we have morphological awareness, which is at a meta-linguistic level. And here it may be useful to remember the case of phonological awareness. So in phonological awareness, the idea was that one directs attention to elements of the language. In that case, it was syllables and phonemes. And one can consciously manipulate them in certain kinds of tasks, indicating an explicit understanding that these parts exist and are combined in specific ways. So phonological awareness was a meta-linguistic skill above the linguistic skill of being able to use the language by speaking properly and understanding words. In a similar way, morphological awareness is a meta-linguistic skill that concerns an explicit understanding of morphology. And since morphology is about word structure and the processes that form words, then morphological awareness is an explicit understanding of how word parts relate to word meanings, how words are formed, how you can form words, and generally it's about an explicit and conscious understanding of the systematic relationship between word forms and word meanings. Implicit knowledge is about language use, which is communication, but explicit knowledge is about conscious manipulation. It's when you don't treat the language elements for communicating, but you treat them as objects in themselves and you basically play with them. So morphological awareness is at the explicit metalinguistic level. However, all this explicit metalinguistic ability doesn't develop overnight and doesn't develop all at once. First of all, one can see a gradual development. So you can say that there are different levels of development of morphological awareness. Again, the example of phonological awareness may be useful. If you recall, there are some relatively easy tasks of phonological awareness that very young kids can do before they can do anything else. For example, kids first are able to say whether two words begin or end with the same sound well before they're able to actually pull out and pronounce the sound or remove the sound and pronounce the rest of the word. So the easy task, the one that is done earlier, only requires a simple judgment, only requires one to direct attention to the language elements. And even if they don't have a very strong or very explicit understanding of what is going on, they can still direct attention to the word beginnings and make a simple judgment. And that would be called an epiphonological level. When one has developed a full-fledged understanding and ability to consciously manipulate these elements, then one has full-blown phonological awareness, and you can say they're at the metaphonological level of operation. Likewise, when it comes to morphological awareness, we can distinguish between early levels of development in which children may be able to perform some simple judgments by noticing similarities between words, for example, from a later level in which children have full-blown morphological awareness and can consciously manipulate word parts to achieve specific meaning goals. Accordingly, the earlier levels are called epilinguistic, epimorphological awareness, and the further developed levels are called metalinguistic or fully blown metamorphological levels of awareness. And these two kinds of levels can be exposed in different kinds of tasks. Simpler tasks only requiring attention and comparison or judgment on morphological elements are used to test epimorphological awareness, whereas more demanding tasks requiring manipulation and production can be used to test metamorphological awareness. To reduce the task demands, one can always use words, indeed familiar words, so that one doesn't have to remember a new stimulus and doesn't have to manipulate morphemes in the abstract. In contrast, when one wants to increase the difficulty of a task, one can use a pseudo word. A pseudo word doesn't have meaning, of course, by definition, but if you have full-blown morphological awareness, which indicates good understanding and ability to manipulate morphemes, then you can apply these processes even to pseudo words. You can apply a derivational suffix onto a pseudo word in order to achieve a goal of creating some meaning combination or a grammatical outcome. So using pseudo words increases the challenge by removing the support by the familiar meaning and by making the task very abstract and very specifically about the conscious manipulation of the morphemes. In addition to these levels of gradual development of awareness, there is a distinction between the three domains. That is, not everything is learned at the same time when it comes to awareness. Children seem to achieve some awareness of compounding first. Compounding seems to be easiest. Children can identify that there are words formed by other words, that you can join words to make another word, and that this has certain consequences on the meaning. And this is mostly present by the time children start school. At this time, children are also well on their way to master an understanding of inflectional morphology. So children's conscious awareness of inflection also begins relatively early, though not as early as compounding. Conscious awareness of derivational morphology may begin relatively early, but is most challenging. It takes longest to complete. So full-blown metamorphological awareness of derivational processes is the most challenging one and the one that is acquired last. Indeed, it is the one that seems to be most strongly related to the reading development process itself. It seems that learning to read makes word parts explicit for the reader, as the child can see the same sequences of letters used across many words to achieve similar purposes. So as soon as children realize that there are common letter patterns that are associated with common meaning elements, then they're on their way to morphological awareness. And this achieves its goal earlier for inflectional morphology and more slowly and gradually for derivational morphology. In this sense, the development of morphological awareness seems to depend to a large extent on the development of reading skill. Conversely, morphological awareness itself supports the development of reading skill because by exhibiting these systematicities at the level of word parts, it helps children decode by providing commonly encountered and familiar letter sequences, and most importantly, it helps children understand what they read, because once one understands that word meanings are often formed by the parts of the words that they're looking at, then one can use the parts in order to understand word meanings and even to learn new word meanings by thinking about the meanings of the word parts. And so that is probably the reason, or at least the most important reason, that morphological awareness is strongly predicting current and future reading comprehension. So those with best morphological awareness in the early and middle elementary school grades are those with the best reading comprehension performance in middle and late elementary grades. It seems that understanding a written passage is strongly related to the ability to decode the words, not in terms of phonological decoding, but in terms of semantic decoding. So break down the words into their meaning-bearing parts and combine these parts in order to understand the meaning of the word and then the sentence and then the text. So morphological awareness strongly predicts reading comprehension. Morphological awareness also predicts decoding in the early stages. We're not completely clear about why that happens. And morphological awareness is also related to early phonological awareness. So it is common to see performance in morphological and phonological awareness to co-vary in the early stages as children begin to learn to read. This may be because both concern the ability to turn attention onto language elements as objects. So maybe they both reflect to some extent a general metalinguistic skill. It may also be because there are some domains where they meet. For example, when it comes to syllables, there are single syllable morphemes that bear meaning, but syllables in themselves are also phonological units. So having an awareness of syllables from the one side is related to developing phonemic awareness and to decoding, and from the other side is related to understanding relationships between word parts and word meanings. And that may be another reason why morphological and phonological awareness are related, and why morphological awareness is also related to early decoding development. This is a relatively new area of research. Morphological awareness has not been studied for as long as phonological awareness has, and there are many fewer studies and many open questions. What seems clear, though, is that morphological awareness is very important to study and follow in the development of reading skill, especially as it relates to better reading comprehension. Indeed, there are proposals in the literature that supporting morphological awareness in targeted intervention may be one way to support reading comprehension for those who are falling behind in that domain.